Welcome to the Healthcare Innovation Podcast. We have Dan Housman, who's a serial entrepreneur. Currently, he is the co-founder and CTO of Graticule, as well as the founder of Courage Therapeutics. In the past, he's also founded Recombinant, which was acquired by Deloitte. Dan's one of the leading persons when it comes to the field of real-world evidence and informatics. I've had a chance to work with Dan in this area for many years. Thank you so much, Dan, for taking the time and welcome to the podcast episode.
Yeah, you're welcome, Purav. It's great to be on and great to talk to you.
Thanks, Dan. So, Dan, one of the first questions for everyone, like real world evidence, which is now real world evidence, but it has gone through many names in the past. How did you get interested in this area? How did you get started on this journey and why?
Oh, so you want me to take me way back? I was formerly in a business that was doing a lot of internet stuff, like e-commerce, and I had a background and still have a background in bio in terms of medicine, studying biochemistry at MIT. And it was around 2001, 2002, sort of the crash of the internet. And I got interested in this space because I wanted to get back to sort of looking at biology and medicine. And I had this interesting opportunity where I met up with a team that was working within Partners Healthcare, which is now called MGB. And the team was building the research data warehouse called RPDR, which actually grew up into a tool called I2B2 that many people know of. And I kind of fell in love with the work we were doing in terms of its ability to have a big impact on patients without having to be a doctor. So I know you're a doctor, but the rest of us have to have an impact, trying to come up with a different way. And so the things we were able to do working within the partner system, not just on the research side, because we did actually both a combination of research, truly research projects, as well as other groups, which we consider to have like a lowercase r, which were research into quality improvement, population health, the meaningful use of the EHR, this is all back in the 2000s, long before the Affordable Care Act and meaningful use. And it became apparent that there was much more opportunity than I ever could have expected in the medical space, which was lagging and maybe probably still is lagging from what you can do inside of, the things I was looking at in the e-commerce world with the birth of things like Amazon, where you can just analyze anything and come up with algorithms, or Google, where you could figure out the best way to connect a person with a message. So, I wanted to dedicate time and energy towards doing those things. Now, that is even predating this idea of real world data, right? Because it was very much in the context of helping a health system to manage their research projects. It became apparent to me that the second issue isn't just that the health systems didn't have a good control of their data, but even worse, the people who are making medicine didn't have the access to doing what they needed to do to improve their products. And these are the products that are some of the most important products in our lives, right? They're the ones that, if they're invented faster, we end up with access to medicines that can help our kids or our families or ourselves. And for the ones that are out there, I wouldn't say it's criminal, but it's surprising how little is available to know what's going on with those products, especially given the context. So, I decided, hey, this is a space where I can apply the skills I picked up both in the world of understanding biology and the skills I picked up in the world of understanding data analytics and how people click on things, to make a difference in people's lives. So I love real world data. I love medical informatics. I think it's, why would anyone do anything else?
It's a great mission to be on. Dan, you've done this for so many years, right? You were there when almost all this started. What was the reason behind starting Graticule? Any specific idea that you wanted to work on? Any specific problem that you wanted to solve when you started Graticule?
Yeah, well, we'll have to start with a lot of things happened between 2001 and 2018, right? So there was, the rise of a lot of open source platforms, the rise of a lot of commercial platforms to help groups better make data accessible and available. And I spent a lot of time living inside of a big consulting firm for about 7 or 8 years. And what I found was all the things we had wanted to do in the health system still were really hard to do in the context of working in a life sciences company trying to do research. And so, the things that I felt were really hard to do was, one thing, getting to the advanced data. So a lot of the questions that need to be answered need a little more data. And when I mean a little more data is, you need to know the genetic status of a patient. You need to know the radiology status of the patient. You need to know a radiology image to understand whether someone's responding or not to an oncology drug. You need to understand whether someone was itchy or not, and that's not an ICD code. There's a new diagnosis that's out, but it doesn't yet have a code. There's a new value that's a lab value that you really only get out of a radiology report. All that stuff is just it's still hard to get at. But it was impossible to get at from what we called real world data, because real world data had been constrained with this maybe artificial barrier, but a real barrier that you couldn't look at information that had a high risk of breaking the wall of patient privacy. So things that might have potentially identifying information were blocked, right? And so I really wanted to see if we could change how we're working to make something work better, right? To get those studies that we couldn't do to be done. So we sort of were looking at that next level, like imagining we've solved some of Maslow's hierarchy of need of real world data with access to claims data. We solved some of it with access to some EHR data. And if we get to this higher level of need, we'll finally get closer to this fulfillment of we can run the studies that really matter to learn what's necessary to make better drugs or better medical devices. And so that was like one big piece. And then the other piece was, I was working before I came into this, a big consulting company has a lot of constraints. The constraints of what you can and can't do. There's risk mitigation people. There's, kinds of contracts that aren't appropriate. There's conflicts of interest. And I felt like it was all getting in the way of just solving problems for groups that want to get them solved. And so, starting a new company, we're able to take on a different risk profile by structuring around knowing where those risks are and how to build a business that can actually take on those risks effectively. And from the ground up, be in a position to solve problems where those are just a part of the reality of doing business. And we're not trying to put patient privacy at risk. We're trying to be able to take on the kind of relationships where we have to work through these complex areas. And like I said, the places that are blocked off are usually like free text notes, right? Radiology images, genetics. Is genetics even ever going to be something that isn't classified as, identifiable? Working through a protocol, sorting out the details with an IRB. Like a big consulting company doesn't want to deal with all that. Right.
It makes sense.
Too much, right? And it's unfortunate for me, but probably fortunate for clients that want to work with folks like myself. I like hard problems, right? Because they have a big impact, right? So I'm getting a little older, and as is everybody else who's been in this field, and I'm impatient with solving easy problems because they can be solved, versus coming up with new ways to solve some of the harder problems.
Makes sense, Dan. So then what does Graticule do today? What are some of the main solutions or offerings that Graticule has for a larger set of listeners?
Yeah, so we've focused in on 3 big solution areas. The first one we call Study Source, and it's basically a consultative service, but also works with our network of partners to be able to source hard to achieve research projects. And so that includes often establishing access to ex-US data for research study by working with, European health systems, which we've done multiple times. Establishing access to more detailed data sets, like being able to build out access to radiology reports or radiology studies for building models to predict things. So, ultimately, we'll work with a client that says, hey, I went to the variety of sources that are out there. I went to Optum and Meritive, and you get on the list. I even went to Health Verity and Datavant, and I asked them how they could get me this data, and it still wasn't there, right? There wasn't a package that I could just spend $100,000 for. It was so much that it was $1 million, and it wasn't what I wanted. Can you put together a program that'll get me the data that I need to support my study? And so we're working with some CROs, we're working directly with some life sciences companies, and we have a, a good footprint in existing health system sites and other partners to be able to source information, which are sort of non-traditional vendors or emerging vendors of real world data, where most groups wouldn't be able to source data there because it would just be too complicated for them to sort through. The second thing we do, we call Patient Finder, and it's really focused on getting to that final point where inside of the environment where patients are making a decision to get on a therapy or get on a trial, the right patients are being focused on. And so, the Patient Finder solution has a couple different segments. On the front end, we work with retrospective data to build predictive models, or even just build models that allow us to stratify populations of patients to say, well, these are the ones we're looking for at the top of the list, and these are the ones at the bottom list, and the rest isn't even on the list, right? So, for example, we're working with a med device manufacturer, which works with high-risk cardiology patients. And we have to find those high-risk cardiology patients who would be a good candidate for their procedure, right? That they use as their device. And so, we retrospectively work with data, but then we try and apply that. In fact, we're even applying it from a sort of planning perspective way back when we're doing these sort of predictive models or these modeling tools, knowing that our end goal is how is this going to work inside a real health system? We're working with really HR data. We'll often build the model in conjunction with a health system partner, at least an expert investigator or an expert clinician who says, here's how I'm really going to use this tool, so that we're not just building a predictive tool, like and publishing a paper. That's not our end goal. Our end goal is something that's useful. And I'd say that someone else could even actually do all of that and we wouldn't even care, because the interesting part of what we're trying to do is how do we now then get that to the point of care and deploy it in the system where there are people doing work day to day using these kinds of models. And so, the big differentiator for us on what we're working on in patient identification, patient finding, is we're working through the processes one health system at a time, maybe sometimes with multiple health systems who share some common tool, to be able to implement these patient ID programs and work through the incentive models, or at least the barriers to adoption of these tools, so that they can have an impact, right? And so it's either in patient recruitment or maybe it's in, access to care or access to a certain offering that otherwise patients aren't made aware of. So that's, the patient capability. And then third, we're working on how can we interface information directly out of electronic health records into EDC systems, the electronic data capture systems that become the research record. And in there, we're building, real connectors, right? Using open standards, focusing mostly on FHIR, but to a degree also on OMOP, on how to pull data out of the electronic record and make something that can be used in a regulatory filing without a lot of hops in between the medical record and what gets into the EDC tool. And I'd say we're not trying to replace what people really do. which is they cut and pasting out of electronic health record into the EDC tool. We're just trying to reduce that labor from like 100% to 20%, so that they can really have the labor available and get more information that's already been input in the health record available, and the longer tail of what they can track when there aren't humans there to do stuff. That's all we do right now, those three things. And there are a lot.
Yeah,
Great.
having worked in this area, totally understand. But to come back to the patient finder solution, the algorithm or the predictive model part of it, many people have attempted before, but the implementation at the health system will solve significant market access problems because a lot of patients don't get the right treatment programs. What is the innovation, Dan? Is it technological innovation? Is it a process innovation to get it into the hands of the physicians?
I mean, I definitely would say it's more a process innovation than a technology innovation, because the truth is, to get technology into a health system, it has to be fairly simple, right? So we're not trying to put, a big piece of infrastructure into the health system to try and get their process to run. We're trying to work with some of the existing infrastructure they have. I certainly think a big boost to us, like an accelerator make this possible from the technology side, is the broad adoption of open standards like OMOP, and the broad adoption of electronic data warehouses like Caboodle from Epic, where we can rapidly interface a tool to data and not have a lot of uncertainty that the output of the tool is going to be somewhat consistent with how we modeled it before we got to the health system. But I have to say, none of the things we were doing from a technology standpoint couldn't be done in a bespoke project, right? So, and that's not where we're going to try and differentiate. The real innovation is, and maybe it's not innovation, it's just the hard work it takes to establish a network, and the hard work it takes to establish, the pathway to access, is working through the governance processes, the required relationship you need to establish these systems, including how to work through some of the technical pieces to support the behavioral change to adopt the system. Right. So we're applying intelligence and blueprints and our own knowledge from every time we do this to allow the next group that wants to do it to not have to start from scratch, because it isn't an easy objective, and most groups fail on the adoption piece, right? They have a fantastic algorithm, and it's an if you build it nobody comes situation. Right. So we want to put all our energy there and have a worse algorithm, but something that gets adopted is a better outcome than a great algorithm that lives only in a lab. Right.
I agree. I've seen so many solutions over the last 5 to 7 years have a lot of promise, but also a lot of it is very vague, right? Like they have these fantastic algorithms, but I don't know, let's say if I'm a pharma company who has come up with a novel product to treat multiple myeloma as an example, I don't know how to use the solution to create patient access. So let's say in this case, if I'm a pharma company who has a novel treatment, how do I work with you to create that market access using Patient Finder?
Yeah, well, obviously we have to go through some evaluation period where we're looking at both the, technical issues, like what does this need to look like in order to solve the social business behavioral issues, which are probably the primary piece of why isn't there access, right? So we start with, well, let's do some design thinking at the level of the health system about, what are their blockers and what can be provided as a tool to reduce those blockers, and what things can be applied as some form of framework to enable adoption. We have some barriers because we're not allowed to pay to play in pharma, right? There's the clear boundary with the Sunshine Act, which we have to be careful on at Graticule, as do any life sciences company that we work with. So, we may often start building capabilities that are focused in a space that's much safer, which is clinical trial recruitment. And so we'll write And let's go down a path before we go into the path of pure market access. Clinical trial recruitment, known problem. You can get the right level of buy-in from both the research team at the site as well as the life sciences company to go do it. And now you have like a framework where you can start with a natural history study, start with some modeling, and build out the kind of capabilities you could use later, but build them out in the context of finding patients for trial. It's a bit of a cop-out because we don't have the actual patient identification scaled up and things like that. So, assuming we either went through that or we can't go through that, working on doing a different kind of program, we have to sort through what's allowable and how can we provide this to the health systems, probably under a research contract. So, if we can't do things to get started in a clinical study doing recruitment, instead we do a research project on, hey, this is ultimately of interest for quality improvement to the health system and to the patients who would benefit from it. Make a sponsored research agreement with a series of health systems to build and test out a new tool. Maybe it's 2 or 3, maybe it's more. And build the tool and test the tool, refine and improve the tool, and do real evaluation work until it's something that is a beneficial piece of software. At which point, then we all have to work together on, well, how does this piece of software transition into something that's commercially viable, right? As well as still living within the boundaries of the regulatory systems, right?
Yeah.
And means either it becomes a product that the health system has to pay for, right? It becomes a product that doesn't live inside the pharma and gets, put into its own universe, right? And then it's offered as open source, it's offered as a utility or something like that, but it has the background of, real publications. But there's lots of options at that point, and it's important to work through them, right? And maybe it is part of the overall patient access program, and it just becomes allowable, assuming everyone's gone through the right review process to see whether or not it's an inducement or an enticement or not. Because there's lots of ways around that as well. Like one of the ways around it is if it's not recommending the product, it's just recommending that someone may have a disorder. That's very different, right? In terms of, so if there's 5 different products you could use if someone has, a certain disease, providing a tool that helps identify the disease is not an inducement to use the product. So, but this is why I'm saying it's probably not the technology that's stopping us from making this work. Great if the regulatory systems were making it easier, but there's a reason why they exist, right? There's a reason why I'm not trying to pay to track. I don't want my doctor recommending a drug because a drug company paid for it. I don't think anyone does, right? I do think if I have a disease that I don't know I have, that it gets diagnosed if there is a treatment for it. Like if there's some progressive disease, if I just took the drug now, and if otherwise I'm going to have the progressed form and it's untreatable, I'd want the test. And if it's because I have a specific hallmark in my blood tests that says take the follow-on genetic test, I'd like to get the genetic test. That's something that should happen in this world, right? Especially if there's ways to line up the economics and the ethics to make it work.
And that was from a pharma and provider perspective. Do payers have a role to play and interface within this? How would they be relevant to this conversation? They naturally have the incentive to kind of do early intervention, especially if there are progressive diseases.
Well, I mean, first of all, one of the reasons why like a diagnostic tool needs to be developed is that like with any diagnostic, and because I think in some sense the idea of these electronic interventions is a new form of diagnostic, right? Anyone who calls himself an AI company, I probably still throw them in the bucket of a diagnostics company, right? They're just not using the same kind of diagnostic, right? They don't pull blood and tell you your genetic markers. They pull, a pile of data and make that a marker. So as a result, getting to your question about payers, in its ideal form, these diagnostic type tools become viable to the point to which a payer can fund them, right? I think the hard part is payers don't fund diagnostic tools on a population. They fund diagnostics on an individual, right? And so it creates a gap And, I'll say it's really hard because the payer solution, at least started by folks like the US government, was when we start looking at populations, the only way we can fund sort of broad diagnostic type activity for population, like we saw in chronic disease management and pop health, was to change the payer dynamic in terms of paying for outcomes and total cost versus paying for utilization. And
Right.
so those are bigger problems that I'm ready to tackle. Right. But that is part of how these things play out, which is where the payers, whether they're the government payers or the private payers, get a lot of cost savings from these events occurring, or they just end up with better services for their paying members. It would be ideal if they would be able to pay for these things. I don't know if we're going to end up with a new class of pop health tools. Again, this is way beyond what I think is feasible right now. But there certainly were waves of population health tools where the payers were paying for chronic disease management, right?
Yep.
And payers could pay for a class of diagnostics that are medical record screening. I just don't think they do it now. So it's hard.
The first time of creating a precedent is the hardest. Once then it becomes normal, they would keep adding different
Yeah.
tools or algorithms.
And what gets harder too is that payers aren't allowed to see the medical record. I mean, they may have the rights to see the medical record, but there's a lot of contention between the payer and the provider about that question. There has been since the day I started working at Partners. We were working at a quality improvement project, and ultimately it was a population health project. And the payer said, we want you to improve these diabetes things. And the provider said, I will only show you exactly what you need to know to see if we met the goals of our pay for performance contract. Because otherwise they would end up in a negotiation over why they shouldn't pay for things. Because they would start pointing at patients and saying, you made the wrong call. And they said, you can't do that. Right. That's not the purpose. And then there's an inherent adversarial relationship in contracting between a payer and a provider, which creates that tension. So anyways, I'm just saying, like, payers are not in a privileged position to be implementing these things. They'll have to just pay for them until some big changes. Right. It's not in Europe and in Canada, where payers and providers in theory are more aligned. Although even in Canada, I found it's not exactly what I thought it was. Right. There's lots of hospitals and they are not aligned with the government payer. That's a single payer system. Same contract. The hospital's not owned by the health system, not owned by the country. Even though the country pays for everything. So I don't know. It's more complex than it looks even in single payer systems.
Very interesting. I think super exciting. I guess a lot of hard work, but the impact of this could be huge. Then I have one last question for you. Like, if there was something on your wish list, like one thing that you or any of the stakeholders could change to accelerate the journey, what would that one thing be?
One thing on our wish list. I mean, it's weird, but I'd say total clarity on the regulatory status of the things we're trying to do. That's probably the biggest barrier to doing the things we're trying to do, right? And probably clarity that aligns with some ethics that is at the core of what's best for the patient. That in the end, all the other stuff, I hate to say it, was like, it's just data stuff, it's just technical stuff. It would all fall in line. The other stuff isn't blockers. It's just not being worked on because the other incentives are misaligned. And then, maybe, I don't know. I think what I would love is just to have, this sort of critical mass of scale, whether it's a scale that's just for us or it's a scale that's for the places we're trying to play, where it's just clear that the things we're trying to do are established and groups want to do them and that they're commonplace. We're still in a bit of an innovation phase, and it's sad. Right, we're in innovation phase of finding treatments that work for patients. Right, we can't sort this out. Right, we can figure out how to like buy exactly the right screw for a bicycle that doesn't work, but we can't figure out how to find, the right thing to do for a patient. And we don't seem to even have a lot of traction to getting past it. So have some of these areas mature and having alignment across, at least for us, those three spaces, so that they're not distinct. Right, sourcing information for retrospective studies really feeds into the tooling for modeling patient finding, and all this is connected into getting drugs or doing surveillance on drugs faster from what's already being entered in the EHR. So we're not really doing three different things. We're doing three things with the same resource, which is electronic health records, ultimately. Right. But we'll see how it all plays out. I'm actually having a lot of fun. Right.
Super exciting. Yeah. Super exciting, and fingers crossed for fast. You have to have a fast resolution to some of these problems with all patients. At some point, it will benefit me, it will benefit you.
Yeah, no, it's great, and it's always a pleasure talking, Purav.
Thank you so much, Dan, for sharing the insights.
Yeah,
very exciting hearing what you're doing.
All right, thanks so much. All right, I'll catch you soon.